They once thundered across Europe, as if the continent itself trembled beneath their tracks. From the rolling fields of France to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, the Panzers carried with them the illusion of invincibility. When their engines roared, villages seemed to shrink into silence. When their silhouettes appeared on the horizon, hope itself seemed to withdraw into the smoke. These machines were more than instruments of war. They were symbols of an age that had traded its humanity for the cold precision of steel. Men had poured not just their labor but their faith into them. Factories hummed day and night, forging armor plates that would deflect shells and break morale, assembling engines whose deep mechanical growl became the anthem of blitzkrieg. Each tank rolled out not merely as a weapon, but as a declaration of dominance. The WWII, with its monstrous 80-planimeter cannon, was said to destroy anything it could see. The Panther, sleek and deadly, was a machine of terrible beauty, balanced between mobility and might. They were kings of the battlefield, feared by all who faced them, and revered by those who built them, until the day the world they served began to crumble beneath them. By the time the war drew its final choking breath in 1945, these steel titans had become stranded relics of a dead empire. They littered the countryside like fallen giants, scattered from the hedgerows of Normandy to the ruins of Berlin. Their treads were broken, their hulls scarred, their insignias smeared with soot and shame. Some lay half buried in the mud where they had been hit and left to rot, their crew's bones still sealed inside. Others sat abandoned along rail lines, their engines long since stripped, their gun barrels rusting toward the sky like forgotten monuments. The air around them still carried the ghosts of battle, the whine of shells, the clang of ricochets, the choking scent of burned fuel and cordite. To pass by one was to feel the echo of power and the terrible silence of defeat. In the days after surrender, Allied soldiers approached them with a strange mix of awe and practicality. Men who had once feared their rumble now climbed atop them for photographs, laughing, cigarettes dangling from their lips. Engineers inspected their construction, tracing with gloved fingers the welds that had once seemed the secret to invulnerability. Some tanks were dragged back to Allied depots for testing, their armor cut apart to study the craftsmanship that had cost so many lives. But the majority, hundreds upon hundreds of them, were left where they stood. To the victors, they were no longer threats, merely problems of metal and logistics. To the defeated, they were reminders of a promise that had ended in fire. The German people, exhausted and hollow from the war's weight, passed by these carcasses with lowered eyes. Children played among them, climbing through hatches once sealed in terror. Farmers used their empty shells as shelters for tools or animals. What had once been a weapon of conquest became, absurdly, part of the landscape, a rusting skeleton of an idea that had failed. Allied occupation forces soon realized that the land could not bear both the ruins of cities and the wreckage of war machines, so they began the process of erasing them. Salvage teams were organized, and scrapyards spread across Germany and occupied territory. Tigers and Panthers were hauled away on flatbeds, their tracks grinding one last time against the gravel, not toward battle, but toward oblivion. In yards near Kassel, Hamburg, and Vienna, the kings of mechanized war met their end, not in glory, but under the hiss of acetylene torches. Workers in torn uniforms cut through armor that had once withstood everything the enemy could throw at it. Flames bit into steel. Sparks showered the ground where thousands had once died. A gun barrel that had silenced tanks across Russia fell with a hollow clang, and no one looked up. It was work, nothing more. A job to feed hungry mouths and rebuild shattered towns. The irony was painful. The very metal that had once destroyed lives now provided the means to rebuild them. Melted down, reforged and repurposed, the Panzers became bridges, plows, rail lines and water pipes. The same steel that had fed destruction now carried water to villages, held up train tracks, and nailed roofs onto new homes. It was redemption by recycling, and yet there was nothing poetic about it for those who remembered what they had been. By 1946, photographs showed scrapyards filled with hundreds of gutted tanks, piles of treads stacked beside engine blocks, turrets lying upside down like dismembered skulls. Each was once a symbol of fear. Now they were anonymous heaps of metal awaiting a furnace. The Allied soldiers who watched the process felt a strange mix of satisfaction and melancholy. Some had lost friends to those machines, and there was justice in watching them reduced to scrap. Yet others, especially the engineers and mechanics, couldn't help but feel a reluctant admiration for their craftsmanship. To see a tiger I cut apart was to destroy a masterpiece of engineering as much as a weapon of war. but no one spoke of sentiment. Europe had no room left for monuments of death. And so, the great Panzers passed from history not with a final roar, but with the quiet hiss of torches and the grind of scrap loaders. Their glory was melted down, their terror forgotten, their names reduced to lines in technical manuals and faded photographs. The empire of steel had devoured itself, leaving behind only fragments of a dream forged in arrogance and ended in ash. Where are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments. It's powerful to see how far these echoes of history still travel. The silence that followed the war was almost unnatural. In the same factories where steel once screamed under the weight of assembly presses, there was only the sound of dripping water and wind sliding through broken windows. These were the cathedrals of the Panzer, places like Henschel in Kassel, MAN in Nuremberg, Daimler-Benz in Berlin-Marienfelde. Once, their furnaces burned day and night, pouring molten iron into molds, shaping plates that would become the ribs and armor of the Reich's most formidable beasts. Now, the furnaces were cold. Their chimneys stood like amputated towers above a nation on its knees. Allied soldiers and engineers wandered through these spaces with notebooks in hand, sketching what remained, documenting blueprints scattered on the floor, gathering every trace of knowledge that could still be useful. The Panzer legacy, they knew, was not something to be worshipped, but something to be understood. Every bolt, every gear, every complex suspension system told a story about how far human ingenuity could go when guided by fear instead of mercy. In the first months after surrender, the Allied Control Council debated what to do with the remnants of Germany's war industry. There were those who argued for total dismantling, to tear apart every factory that had ever forged a tank or a gun, to ensure that no such war machine could ever rise again. Others saw value in preserving the talent of German engineers, whose innovations, though born in darkness, had advanced technology by decades. The compromise was as pragmatic as it was symbolic. Take what was useful, destroy what was dangerous, and leave the rest to rust. Under Operation Lusty and similar programs, both the Americans and Soviets began collecting everything they could find: tanks, blueprints, engines, even the men who had designed them. It was not just steel that was being divided now, but knowledge. The war had ended, but the hunger for superiority had not. Meanwhile, across the ruins of Germany, people were still learning how to live again. The same hands that had once assembled tanks now rebuilt homes from the rubble of cities they had indirectly destroyed. Many of those men had watched the Panzers they built roll out of the factories with pride, believing they were defending their country. Now, they saw photographs of those same tanks gutted and dumped into scrapyards. It was like watching their own labor, their years of skill and devotion, turned into waste. Some refused to speak of it. Others, silently, began collecting pieces of the old machines: a bolt, a plate, a fragment of track, keeping them hidden in boxes as proof that they had once built something mighty. But no one dared display such relics openly. The war had become a wound too raw to touch. Outside Germany, the victors examined the spoils with a different emotion. In Britain, the Bovington testing grounds filled with captured vehicles, Tigers, Panthers, and armoured cars of every kind. Engineers measured their armour thickness, tested their engines, and fired at them to study how they held under pressure. The Soviet Union did the same on a much larger scale, shipping entire battalions of captured tanks eastward for analysis. For years after the war, in remote military ranges outside Moscow and Minsk, German tanks were still rolling, this time under the Red Star. They were dissected, studied, imitated. The Soviets saw in their design the seeds of their own future armoured doctrines. The Americans too took notes, applying lessons from the Panzer's advanced suspension and sighting systems into what would become the M48 and later the M60. The machines that had once fought to preserve tyranny now shaped the defense strategies of democracy. There was irony in, though few cared to acknowledge it then, but not every Panzer ended up in a lab or furnace. Some lingered, stubbornly, in forgotten corners of Europe. In the forests of Poland, villagers discovered half-buried hulls years later, hidden beneath earth and moss. In the Czech countryside, children found rusted Panzerpfeifes lying in streams, their armour cracked but intact, like sleeping beasts that had simply decided not to wake. In France, farmers ploughed around wrecks too heavy to move, their fields divided forever by reminders of war. The local authorities called them iron ghosts. Some were salvaged, others left untouched, merging slowly with the soil. Nature was patient, more patient than any army. As the 1950s dawned, Germany was being rebuilt under Allied supervision. Cities rose again, industries revived, but the tank, once the centerpiece of German might, became a taboo subject. The new factories focused on civilian vehicles, engines for tractors and trucks, machines that would heal rather than harm. For the men who had once lived for the precision of armored design, this transition was painful. Yet in that pain there was a strange dignity. A former engineer from the Henschel plant, interviewed years later, said, "We forged monsters because we were told they would protect us. Now we forge machines that build roads. That is how you undo a sin." Across the ocean, however, the fascination with Panzers grew rather than faded. American museums and collectors sought to preserve them, not as symbols of ideology, but as artifacts of human achievement and folly. In Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, a Tiger II stood fenced off in the sunlight, its once glorious armor pitted with rust, admired by schoolchildren and soldiers alike. The plaques spoke of innovation and terror in the same breath. For all their cruelty, the Panzers had become objects of fascination, not for what they did, but for what they represented, the apex of mechanical genius driven by moral collapse. Yet for all the photographs, exhibitions, and studies, most of the Panzers were gone. Between 1945 and 1950, nearly every remaining German tank that had survived the war was either melted down or scrapped. The official reasons were practical. The world needed raw materials, and Europe needed rebuilding. But beneath that practicality lay something more profound, a collective desire to erase the evidence of how far humanity had gone in its capacity for organized destruction. By reducing those mighty machines to molten metal, the world was trying, in some symbolic way, to reclaim its innocence. Still, the image lingered, of scrapyards stretching into the horizon, filled with the remnants of once terrifying machines. Men with cutting torches moving methodically from one hull to another, unaware that they were dismantling history. The steel screamed faintly as it was split open, the final echo of the war's mechanical chorus. And in the cities beyond, people tried not to listen. The war was supposed to be over, but it still whispered through every spark, every hiss of melting armor. In time, the world moved on. The panzer divisions became pages in textbooks, exhibits in museums, references in films. But for those who had lived through their rise and fall, the engineers, the soldiers, the civilians who watched them roll past their windows, the memory never entirely died. The sight of a tank, any tank, could still stir something deep and uneasy, because they remembered what it meant when machines became gods. If this story of forgotten steel speaks to you, take a moment to subscribe. Every story we tell keeps the memory of those echoes alive, not to glorify, but to understand what they left behind. In the years that followed Germany's surrender, Europe became a continent of silent metal. From the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belarus, tens of thousands of machines lay dormant, their engines cold, their crews long gone. Tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, all left behind like fossils of a world that had devoured itself. But among them, none stirred the same uneasy fascination as the Panzers. Even broken and burnt, they radiated a strange power, as if their very shape carried memory. Farmers ploughing their fields struck them with shovels and curses. Children whispered stories about ghosts trapped inside their hulls. In Poland and Ukraine, whole villages lived beside the carcasses of tanks that no one dared to move. Some said they were cursed, that whoever tried to take their metal would bring misfortune. Others, more pragmatic, simply lacked the tools or strength to shift 30 tons of dead steel from their soil. And so, the tanks stayed, weathering through seasons, their paint fading, their edges softened by moss and rust, until they seemed almost part of the land itself. But not all the tanks were left to decay. The Allied armies saw value in these carcasses, both for study and for salvage. Teams from the British Ministry of Supply and the US Army Ordnance Corps moved across Germany, marking the most intact panzers for shipment. It was not an easy task. Many were booby-trapped by retreating crews. Others were too damaged to recover. Yet the desire to understand them was irresistible. What secrets lay beneath the armor? How had German engineers managed to create machines that still inspired awe even in defeat? In the summer of 1945, convoys of captured tanks began rolling west under Allied control. Panthers, Tigers, and King Tigers were loaded onto railcars bound for test ranges. Bolvington in England, Aberdeen in America, Kubinka in the Soviet Union. At first glance, It might have looked like an extension of the war itself, the same shapes, the same shadows of armor moving across the land. But now, the purpose was different. The Allies were not fighting these machines, they were dissecting them. At Bovington, British engineers worked day and night, cataloguing the captured tanks. The massive Tiger II, whose presence on the battlefield had once struck terror into Allied crews, was stripped piece by piece. Armor plates were cut and tested against British shells. Engines were disassembled, measured, and compared to domestic models. It was an act of both admiration and exorcism, as if by taking the Panzer apart, they could finally understand the monster that had haunted them. Reports described the Tiger's design as complex to a fault, its engineering as brilliant, but over-refined. The Panther, by contrast, was praised for its balance, fast, efficient, deadly. It was the Panther that left the deepest mark, inspiring generations of post-war tank design. Even as the real machines rusted away, their ghosts lived on in the blueprints of every tank that followed. The Soviets took a different approach. To them, the captured Panzers were both trophies and textbooks. In vast proving grounds outside Kubinka, they conducted brutal trials, running the tanks until their engines failed, firing shells point-blank into their armor, measuring every fracture and burn. Soviet engineers, many of whom had faced these machines on the battlefield, treated them with a cold, clinical curiosity. They respected their enemies, but they also sought their weaknesses. Out of that study emerged the designs that would shape the Cold War, the T-54, the T-55, tanks that blended the lessons of German precision with Soviet pragmatism. Ironically, the ghosts of the Wehrmacht's Panzers found new life under the red flag. Meanwhile, in the occupied zones of Germany, another kind of dismantling was underway, one far less scientific and far more desperate. The war had left the country starving, coal was scarce, industry shattered, and metal was worth more than pride. Civilians scavenged the countryside for anything that could be melted, traded, or rebuilt. Tanks became resources. A Panther's armor could be cut and sold as scrap to buy food. Its engine could be repurposed to power sawmills or generators. There were stories of farmers using tank transmissions to drive plows, of church bells recast from melted gun barrel. In one small village near Aachen, locals even built a bridge using the hull of a Panzer IV turned sideways over a creek, a strange monument to survival. Every trace of the war, it seemed, could be turned into something useful, if only one looked past the blood that had been spilled to make it. Still, for those who had fought, on both sides, the sight of these tanks being dismantled was unsettling. Allied soldiers who had lost friends to them watched as they were carved into pieces by torchlight. German veterans, returning from prison camps, found their once proud machines rusting in public squares, children climbing their turrets, pigeons nesting in their hatches. It was humiliation turned tangible. A former Panzer commander, interviewed in 1948, said bitterly, "They were our kings, now they are toys and scrap." Maybe that is justice, but it feels like watching your own bones being ground to dust. There were even darker uses for the wrecks. In Eastern Europe, where mines still littered the soil, old tanks were sometimes used as shields. Farmers pushed them ahead of tractors to trigger hidden explosives. The war, it seemed, refused to end. It merely changed shape. Each tank, each rusted hulk, carried a piece of that unfinished conflict, a physical reminder of what humanity had built to destroy itself. By the early 1950s, efforts were made to clean the landscape of these remnants. Salvage companies, often working under Allied contracts, moved through the countryside recovering abandoned vehicles. The process was enormous and slow. Many tanks had to be cut into pieces on site before they could be hauled away. Photographs from the time show vast fields covered in twisted metal, entire forests of discarded armor awaiting the torch. To most people, they were simply obstacles, inconvenient leftovers of a nightmare best forgotten. But to a few, historians, engineers, even soldiers, those fields represented something more profound, the physical residue of human ambition gone too far. The testing continued for years, long after the public lost interest. In isolated corners of research facilities, pieces of Panzers were still being examined, their alloys studied, their construction methods adapted. What had once been a machine of terror had become a teacher. Yet, paradoxically, the more these tanks were studied, the more they faded from memory. Their physical forms disappeared, but their influence spread invisibly through new generations of armored design. The world no longer built Tigers or Panthers, but every tank that followed, American, Soviet, British, carried something of their legacy, like a scar passed down through bloodlines. And then, there were the ones that escaped history altogether. Buried under collapsed bridges, submerged in swamps, hidden in forests, they waited. Sometimes decades would pass before a storm or construction project uncovered one. When that happened, it was as if time itself had paused, the paint still faintly visible, the insignia barely faded, the smell of oil and metal trapped inside. Each discovery reminded people that the war's ghosts were not gone, merely sleeping. The world had melted most of its monsters, but some had refused to die. By the time the last scrapyards were emptied and the last test reports filed away, the Panzers were no longer just weapons or machines. They had become stories, fragments of a cautionary legend about power, pride, and the cost of forgetting. Europe had melted their steel, but it could not erase their shadow. Every bridge built from their armor, every machine forged from their parts, carried an invisible weight, a whisper of engines that once roared for conquest, and a reminder that nothing built for destruction can ever be entirely undone. Time buried the tanks, but it never truly silenced. The war had ended in fire, yet its echoes lingered beneath the soil, locked inside the twisted hulls of the machines that had once ruled it. For decades, the wrecks lay hidden in forests, fields, and riverbeds, sleeping giants encased in rust and earth. Nature, indifferent to human memory, began to reclaim them. Moss crept over their turrets, roots split their armor seams, and snow filled their empty interiors like shrouds. Farmers tilled their fields above them, unaware that just beneath the surface lay the carcasses of the past. Hunters stumbled upon them while tracking deer in the woods, glimpsing through the fog a curved shape of steel that seemed at first like a boulder, until the faint cross of the Balkenkreuz emerged beneath the grime. For those who found them, the discovery was never ordinary. Standing before a tank that had once shaped the fate of nations, now reduced to a grave of iron, was to stand face to face with history itself, silent, cold, and impossibly near. In the 1960s and 70s, as Europe rebuilt and began to look backward with both pride and guilt, these buried relics became objects of fascination. Amateur historians, veterans, and collectors formed search groups dedicated to finding the last traces of the war's machines. Some were driven by nostalgia, others by curiosity, and a few by a need to make peace with ghosts they could not forget. They combed through wartime maps, interrogated elderly villagers, and followed rumors whispered in taverns about the tank in the marsh or the tiger in the forest. Many of these hunts led nowhere, just rusted fragments, twisted metal, tracks embedded in concrete. But occasionally, the earth revealed something astonishing. A panther lying half submerged in a Polish river, its hull preserved by mud. A tiger pulled from a Latvian swamp with its markings still faintly visible. A Panzer IV discovered intact beneath a collapsed barn in France. Each recovery was a resurrection, not just of steel, but of memory. The machines that had once vanished in smoke were rising again, not for war, but for remembrance. Television crews began to follow these recoveries, turning them into events. Spectators gathered as cranes lifted massive hulls dripping with mud, their steel groaning like something alive. When the surface broke, when sunlight struck armor that hadn't seen the sky since 1944, there was always a hush, a strange reverence, as though a god of war were being exhumed. Children stared in wonder, old men turned away, tears welling without reason. Reporters spoke of historic discoveries, of mechanical time capsule, TIU. But those who stood closest to the wrecks often said they felt something different, a pressure in the air, an unease that came not from admiration but from guilt. It was as if the earth itself resented having its scars reopened. The tanks had been buried once, not just to remove them from the land, but to hide what they represented. And now, decades later, they were being dragged back into the light. Museums and private collectors quickly realized the value of these finds. Restorations began across Europe, often taking years and involving thousands of hours of labor. Engineers cleaned and rebuilt engines that hadn't turned since the Reich fell. Painters recreated the faded camouflage patterns with obsessive precision. Some restorations went further still, replacing missing parts with newly forged replicas, making the machines functional again. The result was a paradox. War machines once meant to kill were now preserved with love. A handful of museums, like Saumur in France and Bovington in England, became sanctuaries for these resurrected giants. Visitors came from all over the world to stand beside them, to hear their engines roar once more in demonstration runs. The air filled again with the deep, guttural growl of Maybach engines, the same sound that once made soldiers tremble. But now it stirred a different emotion. Awe, not fear. Fascination, not hatred. And yet for some, that difference was not so clear. For veterans who visited these exhibitions, the experience was deeply conflicted. Some wept at the sight of the very machines that had taken their comrades' lives. Others found strange comfort in seeing them silent, tamed, and displayed like ancient beasts in a cage. "It's strange," one British veteran said during an interview at Bovington in 1982. "I used to dream of burning these things to ashes. Now, I find myself touching one, and it feels sad, as if it too was a victim of the madness." That sentiment echoed through many who encountered these relics. The Panzers had been built by human hands, driven by men who, for all their indoctrination, were mortal and afraid. The line between enemy and victim had blurred long ago. By preserving their machines, humanity was perhaps preserving a piece of its own failure, a warning carved in steel. In Eastern Europe, where the scars of war ran deeper, the discoveries carried an even heavier weight. In Belarus and Ukraine, tanks were unearthed with remains still inside, bones wrapped in rotted uniforms, medals still pinned to rib cages. Recovery teams treated these finds as both archaeological and spiritual acts. The tanks were not just machines, they were tombs. Ceremonies were held before removing them, priests blessing the ground, soldiers saluting the dead. When the hulls were finally lifted and the human remains extracted, they were buried with military honors, sometimes 70 years after they had fallen. The tanks themselves were often placed in memorial parks, left unpolished, unpainted, their rust allowed to tell its own story. Visitors would lay flowers on their track, not out of admiration, but remembrance. In these places, the Panzer was no longer a symbol of terror. It had become a monument to futility. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the rediscovery of lost Panzers had become an almost mythic pursuit. Television programs documented them, collectors paid fortunes for fragments, and black markets for tank parts emerged in Eastern Europe. The very machines that had once been dumped like junk were now worth more than gold. A single Tiger turret, unearthed in good condition, could fetch hundreds of thousands of dollars. Museums competed for authenticity, claiming their exhibits contained the only operational Tiger in the world. The irony was brutal. What had been unwanted, melted and discarded now commanded reverence and money. Humanity, it seemed, could not decide whether it wanted to forget its monsters or keep them close, just in case forgetting made them easier to repeat. Still, beyond the collectors and museums, there remained those who felt uneasy about the resurrection of these machines. They saw in the fascination a dangerous nostalgia, a creeping romanticism that threatened to distort memory. To them, a tank should remain in the mud, exactly where it fell, as a reminder of what should never rise again. A historian once wrote, "Every Panzer unearthed from the ground brings with it the weight of the men it buried. To restore it without remembering them is to betray the lesson of the century." And yet, the world continued to dig. Perhaps it was because the Panzers represented something larger than war, the human obsession with control, the belief that through technology we could master destiny. Seeing them corroded and lifeless was a humbling sight. Seeing them restored, rumbling once again under sunlight, was a temptation, a dangerous reminder of the thrill of power. In the end, the recovered tanks became mirrors more than monuments. Each one reflected something different: curiosity, reverence, guilt, pride. For the old, they were echoes of nightmares. For the young, they were puzzles of steel and history. But for everyone who stood before them, there was always that same uneasy silence, the sense that these machines, though dead, still carried within them the heartbeat of a century that had almost destroyed itself. And now, looking at those relics standing in museums or rising from rivers, one cannot help but wonder, when we dig up the weapons of the past, are we preserving history or are we trying to wake it? If you've ever stood before a relic that made you feel that same chill of memory, tell me in the comments, what object, what moment has ever made you feel the weight of history like that? Copy and paste this if you've ever felt that silence speak. The past never dies, it only waits. Decades after the war's end, when Europe's scars had healed into landscapes of glass and commerce, the Panzers had taken on a strange afterlife. Once the embodiment of fear, they had become subjects of study, objects of curiosity, and in some circles, symbols of craftsmanship. Their ghosts lingered not in the roar of engines, but in photographs, blueprints, and the minds of men who could not forget what humanity had built in its darkest hour. In Germany itself, the image of the Panzer became almost unspeakable. For years, the very word carried a moral weight that could silence a room. It was not just a machine, but a reminder of the ideology it had served, an iron extension of belief turned into violence. Yet as time softened memory and generations changed, a quiet transformation began. The Panzer was no longer seen only as a tool of tyranny. It began to be studied as a triumph of engineering, a mechanical paradox born of brilliance and blindness. In universities and technical institutes, students examined its blueprints not as instruments of war, but as lessons in design. The precision of the German engineering mind had survived its moral collapse. Professors spoke of torsion bar suspension systems and overlapping road wheels with the same detached fascination once reserved for cathedrals or symphonies. The machine had outlived its meaning, stripped of ideology, leaving only geometry and steel. Museums curated exhibitions with careful language, calling them technological milestones or industrial achievements, while avoiding words like glory or superiority. It was a balancing act, a moral tightrope between acknowledging genius and condemning the use it was put to. For many, especially in post-war Germany, the Panzer became a mirror reflecting a national struggle, the attempt to separate pride in skill from shame in purpose. Elsewhere in Europe, and even across the Atlantic, the fascination grew more freely. Model makers, historians, and enthusiasts pored over details of turret angles, armor thickness, engine configurations. The Panzer became mythologized, its flaws forgotten, its terror abstracted into nostalgia. For a generation raised on films and documentaries, the tank was no longer a weapon, it was a character. Its shape, instantly recognizable, came to represent an era when history still seemed clear, when good and evil wore uniforms, and the world could be understood in black and white. But history, as it always does, resisted such simplicity. Beneath every polished restoration, every glossy book cover, every museum plaque, the truth still hummed like a low vibration. These machines had killed and been killed for a cause that devoured the men who built them. In rural Germany, the remnants of the old war industry remained scattered, empty factories now converted into housing or silent memorial. The descendants of the engineers who had once designed Panzers worked for automotive companies or aerospace firms, their families carrying unspoken stories. Some never mentioned what their fathers or grandfathers had done during the war. Others spoke of it quietly, as a kind of inheritance, not of guilt, but of craftsmanship. They built what they were told to build, one man said, standing outside the ruins of an old Henschel foundry. But they built it well. That was their sin and their pride. That sentence captured the essence of post-war Europe's relationship with the Panzer, the uncomfortable union of admiration and remorse. By the 1980s, the fascination had grown into an entire subculture. Magazines, conventions, and reenactments emerged, all orbiting around the machines of the Second World War. Restored Panzers appeared at events where they rumbled across fields under the control of men who had never known war, but longed to touch its shadow. Some saw it as historical education, others saw it as dangerous nostalgia. The line between remembrance and glorification blurred easily. It was not uncommon to see men dressed in meticulously recreated uniforms, standing beside tanks once used to crush entire towns. They said it was for history, to keep memory alive, but for those who had lived through the real thing, it was unbearable theatre. Survivors and veterans protested, asking why humanity always seemed to reenact its tragedies as entertainment. Yet the answer was as old as the machines themselves. People are drawn to what they fear and fascinated by what they should forget. In Poland, Russia, and the Baltic states, where the ground still held the bones of those who had fallen beneath the tracks of German armour, the attitude was different. There, the tanks remained monuments to suffering. Local museums kept them exactly as they were found, dented, burned, pierced through with shells. They stood in open fields under rain and snow, rusting naturally, unpolished, untouched. Visitors placed candles beneath them, not flowers. The message was simple. These were not relics to admire, but warnings to remember. Every rivet was a story, every hole a name. Children were taught not to cheer at their sight, but to bow their heads. And yet, even there, fascination crept in. Photographers sought the perfect angle. Tourists posed for pictures. Memory, like rust, spread slowly and unevenly. It was during this period that a quiet philosophical question began to haunt historians and curators alike. Could a machine be innocent? Could the Panzer be admired without excusing the crimes it served? Some argued that technology in itself carries no morality, that a tank is only a tool, a mirror reflecting the intentions of its maker. Others disagreed, claiming that the Panzer was too deeply intertwined with the ideology that its very existence was an act of aggression, a manifestation of a worldview that believed power justified everything. This debate still lingers, unresolved, hovering over every display case and museum tour. The Panzer, it seems, continues to fight, not with shells, but with meaning. As the 20th century faded into the 21st, the world's last surviving Panzers became sacred objects of a strange faith, a faith in remembering, in understanding, in never repeating. Their steel bodies, preserved against time, became both altars and tombs. Tourists stood before them with cameras, unaware that the ground beneath their feet once shook with fear of that same silhouette. The irony was perfect. The tank that had been designed to erase human individuality had, in death, become an object of deeply personal reflection. People saw in it what they wanted to see: power, tragedy, mastery, loss, and perhaps that was fitting. After all, the Panzer was never just a machine. It was an idea given form, the belief that perfection could exist in steel, that control could be absolute, that war could be made clean. Time had proven all of that false, but the myth endured, rust and all. And so, in the quiet halls of museums and the crowded fields of reenactments, the ghosts of the Panzers roll on, silent but not still. They remain part of the human story, not as conquerors or victims, but as witnesses. Witnesses to the limits of genius, to the dangers of obedience, to the fragile line between admiration and atonement. By the turn of the century, the Panzers existed in two worlds, one of memory and one of metal. In the first, they lived as symbols, ghosts haunting textbook, films, and documentaries. In the second, they remained as tangible artifacts, hulks of iron scattered in museums and forgotten fields. Together they formed a strange duality, machines without motion, yet never truly at rest. In towns where they were displayed, they drew visitors who came not for glory, but for understanding. Children pressed their hands against the cold armor, unable to imagine it once alive with the roar of engines and the screams of war. Their grandparents stood beside them, remembering a time when that sound meant death was coming. The distance between the two generations could be measured not in years, but in comprehension. One had lived through the fear, the other inherited its echo. In Germany, remembrance became a discipline, almost a ritual. The post-war generations, who bore none of the guilt yet all of its shadow, learned to confront their inheritance: education, art, and silence. School trips to war museums were not celebrations but confessions. Standing before a Panzer in a glass enclosure, students were told not of victory or defeat, but of responsibility, of how technology, ambition, and obedience had fused to create instruments that outlasted their purpose. Many left those exhibits with a quiet discomfort, a realization that history was not something that ended. It was something that lived on in forms of steel and memory. The Panzer became a teacher, cold, mute, but unrelenting, forcing each new generation to look into the reflection of its armor and see what mankind is capable of when conscience sleeps. Yet outside of Germany, the fascination continued to evolve into something more ambiguous. In the United States, restoration teams worked passionately on captured Panzers, treating them as engineering challenges, puzzles to be solved. Documentaries highlighted the brilliance of their design, often forgetting the destruction they caused. In Russia, military museums displayed them as trophies of victory, their presence meant to validate the sacrifice of millions. And across Europe, enthusiasts built replicas, hosted reenactments, and published technical manuals with the reverence once reserved for holy texts. Some saw in this a healthy curiosity, a way to study and preserve history. Others saw something more troubling: the slow romanticization of the machinery of death. The deeper people studied the Panzer's mechanics, the more they risked forgetting the purpose it had been built for. The same steel that once silenced cities was now polished and adored beneath bright museum lights. Survivors of the war, now in their twilight years, viewed this transformation with mixed feelings. To some, it was healing, a way of turning fear into knowledge, of reclaiming control over memories that had once owned them. But to others, it felt like betrayal. They watched young men restoring Panzers with excitement, posting photographs online, speaking of beauty and innovation, and wondered how easily the world forgets what beauty costs. They see machines, one old man said during an interview near Dresden. I see coffins made of steel. He had been a child when the tanks rolled through his village, their shadows swallowing the sun. The sight of one still made him shiver, even after 70 years. He said he dreamed of them sometimes, rolling slowly through streets that no longer existed, silent, searching for something lost. He never said what. The further time carried the world from the war, the more the Panzers became relics of contradiction. In classrooms, they were cautionary tales. In museums, they were treasures. On film, they were legends. And in the private collections of the wealthy, they were trophies. Humanity had dismantled the armies, erased the empires, rebuilt the cities, but it had never stopped finding meaning in the machines. The Panzer, once an instrument of domination, had become a vessel for all the emotions that war leaves behind: fascination, shame, awe, and denial. Its silence spoke louder than its cannons ever did. It reminded people not only of what had been done, but of what could be done again, given the right mixture of fear and faith. There were attempts, in some places, to remove the tanks from public view altogether, to bury them again, this time in archives instead of earth. But memory does not bury easily. Every time one was taken away, another was found. A rusted hull discovered by accident during construction, a turret dragged out of a river by fishermen, a fragment uncovered in the forest after a storm. Each discovery reignited the same debate. Should we display them, or should we let them rest? Should we learn from them, or should we stop giving them breath? It was an argument not about machines, but about morality, about how a civilization chooses to remember its sins. And still, they endured. In Kubinka, in Bovington, in Sawmia, and in the quiet countryside of Poland, they stood as relics of an age that had promised 1,000 years and lasted barely 12. Their steel bodies weathered the decades, but their meaning shifted with every pair of eyes that looked upon them. To a child, they were stories. To a veteran, they were graves. To a historian, they were evidence. To a dreamer, they were power. That, perhaps, was their final victory, not in war, but in memory. For as long as they existed, they kept alive the reminder that progress without conscience is not evolution, but decay dressed in iron. The machines no longer moved, but the idea behind them never stopped. Even in modern warfare, the lineage of the Panzer lived on, its descendants sleeker, faster, deadlier, yet born of the same ancient logic that whoever controls the strongest engine controls the world. Engineers still spoke of armor angles and ballistic coefficients, still sought perfection in lethality. They studied the past, not always to avoid repeating it, but sometimes to refine it. And in that cycle, the shadow of the Panzer lengthened, invisible but ever present, reminding humanity that the line between remembering and repeating is thinner than a sheet of steel. Time, however, has its own justice. The last men who built or drove these machines are nearly gone now. Their stories fade with, leaving only metal and myth. But every once in a while, in a quiet museum or on a lonely road through the countryside, someone will stop and stare at the outline of a tank and feel something unexplainable, a shiver that has nothing to do with admiration, but everything to do with recognition. Because deep down, we all understand what these machines were. Not monsters, not heroes, but mirrors. They show us the part of humanity that builds wonders in the service of destruction, and the part that, even after the fire, cannot look away. The last survivors of the generation that saw the Panzers in motion are fading now, leaving behind a silence that feels heavier than any explosion. Across Europe, the last witnesses die quietly in their beds, carrying with them the sounds, the smells, the weight of those steel beasts crawling across the earth. Their memories are fragments, the vibration of the ground as treads passed nearby, the sudden crash of an artillery shell, the smell of hot oil and fear. When they are gone, what remains will be only the artifact, the photographs, the wrecks sealed behind museum glass. The machines will outlive their makers, their victims, even their enemies. Perhaps that is the final irony, that humanity's most terrible creations endure longer than the hearts that built or broke them. And as the living memory fades, the question grows louder. What will the world remember when no one remains who felt the earth tremble under the tank's advance? The answer lies in the way we choose to look at those relics now. In the careful hands of curators, they are reminders, not of power, but of consequence. Each bolt and rivet carries a story, each dent a confession. In the soft lighting of museums, they seem almost peaceful, their menace dulled by time. But if one listens long enough, the echoes still whisper. They tell of the fields they crossed, of the lives they ended, of the arrogance that forged them. Standing before one, you cannot help but feel both pride and sorrow. Pride in what human skill can achieve, sorrow in what it so often chooses to serve. That contradiction is the true legacy of the Panzer, the proof that brilliance without conscience becomes ruin. Outside those halls, in the open air, Nature continues to reclaim what humanity once tried to dominate. Trees grow through shattered turrets, grass curls through track links, rain gathers in the hollows where engines once burned. The earth is patient. It waits. Given enough time, even the strongest steel turns to dust. Perhaps this is justice, the slow forgiveness of the planet itself, not mercy, but balance. The Panzers, once the embodiment of unstoppable force, now rust quietly into the same soil that once bled because of them. In their decay lies a lesson deeper than any textbook can teach, that everything built on violence eventually returns to silence. But even as they vanish, the idea remains, a hum in the collective memory of humanity. Engineers still study their lines, filmmakers still resurrect their image, writers still chase their shadows across the page. The Panzer endures not because of what it was, but because of what it represents, the eternal human temptation to perfect destruction. That is why their story matters, not as nostalgia, not as reverence, as warning. For if the past has taught us anything, it is that the moment we begin to admire the tools of war more than we fear them, the cycle begins again. The steel may change, the symbols may shift, but the hunger beneath remains the same. And so, the legacy of the Panzers is not one of glory or defeat. It is a question, one that every generation must answer for itself. How do we honor progress without worshipping power? How do we remember without reliving? How do we preserve the relics of war without reviving the faith that made them? The answers are not simple, and perhaps they never will be. But standing before the cold remains of those machines, you can feel that the question itself is worth asking. It is what separates remembrance from repetition. In the end, the Panzers were not destroyed by bombs or shells. They were undone by time, by rust, by memory, by the quiet resilience of a world that learned, at unbearable cost, that no empire of steel can last forever. The scrapyards that once melted them down became factories for peace. The forges that shaped their armor now craft the skeletons of bridges, the frames of trains, the shells of everyday machines that serve life instead of death. The circle turned, as it always did. What was once an instrument of destruction now supports the weight of cities rebuilt from its ashes. And maybe that is the only kind of redemption possible for such creations. Not forgiveness, but transformation. The same iron that once tore the world apart now holds it together. The Panzers, in their silent afterlife, remind us that even from the ruins of cruelty, something can be rebuilt. The shape may change, the purpose may heal, but the memory must never be erased. To forget would be to risk awakening them again, not the tanks themselves, but the belief that made them possible. So when you look at a rusting hull in a field, or a gleaming restoration in a museum, remember what it truly is. Not a machine, not a monument, a mirror, a reflection of what we were, what we can become, and what we must never be again. The war ended long ago, but its echoes still roll across the earth, faint as thunder on a distant horizon. Listen closely, and you can almost hear them, the last breath of the battle fading into history, carried away by the wind. If you've reached this far, take a moment to reflect, to like, to share, to remember. Every story kept alive is one less lesson lost, and every lesson remembered is one more reason to keep the engines of war forever silent.